While Napoleon is stuck in the sands at the walls of Acre, in Europe a powerful coalition is preparing to strike France. One of the armies is operating in Italy. Its commander is Alexander Vasilyevich Suvorov, an outstanding field marshal with 50 years of service in the Russian Imperial Army. A terror to the Ottomans and Poles, he leads the Allied armies from victory after victory, destroying Napoleon's achievements and threatening France itself with invasion. Facing the treacherous incompetence of his allies, pushing through imaginable and unthinkable obstacles, he fights his last great campaign. The Peace of Campo Formio, made by Bonaparte, seemed to end the exhausting war for a long time to follow. But, as time proved, this was an illusion. Just a few months later, the French invaded Switzerland, and the best troops of the Republic were already preparing to strike Egypt. In May, Napoleon sailed off the coast of France. On his way to Egypt, he captured the small island of Malta. This seemingly insignificant event had a huge impact on the situation in Europe. The island was in the use of the Order of Malta, but belonged to Naples. In addition, a great admirer and protector of the Order of Malta was the Russian Emperor Paul I. It was under his patronage went to some knights who illegally declared him Grand Master of the Order. After Napoleon landed in Egypt, Paul made an alliance with the Ottoman Empire against France and sent Admiral Ushakov's squadron to liberate the Ionian Islands from the French. A coalition of Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, Naples, and Austria was soon formed. One of the strikes was planned in Italy, but the Allies could not choose a commander-in-chief. But eventually, after much debate, Alexander Suvorov was chosen.
For his 69 years, he won many victories over the Ottomans, Poles. His name is associated with the success of Russian foreign policy under Catherine the Great. But after her death, her son Paul took the throne, a man of highly unpredictable character. He began reforms of the Russian army on the Prussian model. Suvorov opposed the idea and was fired. False reports followed that he was preparing a plot against the Tsar. Suvorov was sent into exile in a remote village with strict supervision. Hard days of disgrace followed. But Suvorov closely watched the events in Europe. After receiving information about Napoleon's victories in Italy, he was fascinated. Suvorov very highly praised Bonaparte's talents. It is not surprising, their art of war was in many ways similar. Suvorov formulated it in 3 words: eye detector, speed, onslaught. Thinking about a future war with France, he dictated his main ideas. Act in no other way than offensively. In the march, speed; in the attack, swiftness, cold weapons. There is no need for methodism, only the correct military view. Full authority to the commander-in-chief. The enemy to attack and beat in the field. No time to waste in sieges, except for some mines as a staging post. Sometimes observation corps, blockade, and best of all, open assault. There are less casualties. Never split forces to occupy points. The enemy bypassed, all the better. He himself goes to defeat. He's said to go straight for Paris. Suddenly in February 1799, a courier arrives in the village with an order from the emperor to lead the Allied army in northern Italy. It was like the old man had become younger. His former energy, suppressed by exile, returned. His eyes were burning with enthusiasm. Without wasting time, he rushed to St. Petersburg, where Paul at the meeting awarded Suvorov the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. This means an apology. The Tsar gave the Field Marshal the right to contact him directly instead of through intermediaries. Paul perceived the war with France as purely ideological, to restore thrones in the church. Soon Suvorov rushed across the borders of Russia, Austria, and entered Vienna, greeted by an excited crowd. He stayed at the house of Razumovsky, the Russian ambassador in Vienna. During his long stay in Austria, the ambassador clearly began to defend Austrian interests, not Russian. Suvorov met first with the Austrian Emperor Franz, who made him Austrian Field Marshal, and then with Tugut, the man who would become the Field Marshal's main enemy in the future campaign. Tugut was the head of the Austrian Court Military Council, or Hofkriegsrat, a council that had complete control over all the actions of the generals. A man who was perhaps a good administrator, Tugut considered himself a military genius. Though he understood little about warfare, he had the full support of the emperor and immense power. Suvorov could defeat French armies on the battlefield, but defeating Tugut was beyond him. Tsar Paul sending Suvorov to Austria as a kind of transferring him into the subordination of the Austrian emperor. But Suvorov obviously did not consider himself subordinate to the Austrians. To the members of the Hofkriegsrat who asked him about the plans for the campaign, he replied, "I will start at the Adda and end wherever God wills." Before the field marshal's departure, Emperor Franz wrote him an instruction. "My desire is that the first offensive actions of the army have the purpose of covering my own possessions and the gradual removal from them the danger of enemy invasion. By reporting to me all incidents, you will at the same time inform me of your thoughts about further actions. But to ensure that your attention was not diverted from the main considerations of military any concerns about the subjects of side, I instructed General Malas to correspond with my military council on food and other needs for troops." Suvorov, leaving Vienna, probably thought that he would have freedom of action despite the Hofkriegsrat's remarks. It was not destined to be. During the absence of Malas, the Austrian forces in Italy were commanded by General Kray. He was opposed by the French under the command of Scherer, who was extremely unpopular with the troops and generally incompetent. However, under orders from the Directory, Scherer launched an offensive that ended in failure. In a series of maneuvers, Kray inflicted on him a decisive defeat at McDonald. The initiative passed to the Allies.
Suvorov rushed to the army and on the way met with Quartermaster General Schettler, a well-educated man who will show himself perfectly in connection with the field marshal. Suvorov writes the army an instruction. It is necessary to attack. Cold weapons, bayonets, sabers. Smash and take without losing a moment. Defeat all, even unimaginable obstacles. Chase on the heels. Exterminate to the last man. He arrives at Verona, where he is greeted enthusiastically by the Italians. He went on to write in proclamation to the Italian people, "Arm yourselves, peoples of Italy, for the defense of your holy faith, for the restoration of your legitimate governments, for the recovery of your property. The Allied army fights and bleeds now. Have not the rulers of France taxed you immensely? Do they not complete your ruin by the cruelty of military levies?" On April 15th, Suvorov arrives at Valeggio, where he writes many orders for the Austrians to be trained from the Russians to attack daily with cold weapons. The Austrians were not happy about this. Some were insulted, some thought it was nonsense. Suvorov began the campaign on April 19th. General Schettler offered him insistently to make a reconnaissance. Suvorov replied, "Reconnaissance? I do not want it. It is needed only for cowards and to warn the enemy of its appearance. When they want to find the enemy, always find it. Columns, bayonet, cold weapons, attack, strike, that's my reconnaissance." The campaign had begun, and soon thunder would rumble over northern Italy. French forces in Italy consisted of the army of Scherer after the defeat at Magnano and the abandonment of garrisons in Peschiera and Mantua numbered 25,000 men, and the army of McDonald in the south in the newly established by the French Parthenopean Republic, over 30,000 men. The Allies could move to the offensive no more than 52,000 men. The rest besieged Peschiera, Mantua, and other fortresses, guarding communications. Suvorov began the offensive on April 19th, waiting for the arrival of Russian forces under the command of Rosenberg. The movement of both armies was hampered by heavy rains, which washed out the roads. Scherer's march was particularly disorganized. The first Allied strike came at Brescia. The vanguard of Bagration, Ott under the general command of Kray, approached the city, which was also threatened from the north by Vukasovich's column. The garrison locked itself inside the fortress. The Allies stormed the city, bombarded the citadel for some time, and by evening forced the French to capitulate. Casualties in the assault were light. This first victory encouraged the army. General Kray was then sent to Mantua to take command of all the troops besieging that important fortress. The movement of the Allies continued. Suvorov at first supposed that the retreating French would halt at the Oglio River, but Scherer, afraid of the bypass movement of the Allies and due to the poor condition of his troops, retreated behind the river Adda. During the march, because of the rain, soldiers of Melas stopped. Suvorov criticized the general. "I hear complaints that the infantry got their feet wet. Such was the weather. This campaign is made for the service of the imperial emperor. Dry weather is for maidens, dandies, lazy men. Braggarts and egotists are now not needed for high service and cannot command. Operations must be carried out quickly and without the slightest loss of time, so as in no way to allow the enemy's forces to combine." On April 23rd, Bagration's vanguard engaged in a skirmish with the rearguard of Serurier at Palazzolo. The commander of the entire column, Shveikovsky, delayed. Suvorov criticized him because he should be with the entire column, approaching and not stopping, to enter the action immediately. Instead, he stopped and went there with a part. The next day, the Cossacks of Grekov and Denisov, pursuing the enemy, broke into Bergamo, taking both the city and the citadel, and more than 100 French prisoners. On April 25th, the Allied army reached the Adda River. Vukasovic and Rosenberg's Russians in front of Brivio in the north, Bagration's vanguard on the way to Lecco. Ott's and Zoff's divisions encamped at San Gervasio in front of Trezzo. Melas with Kames and Freilich's divisions at Treviglio in front of Cassano. At this time, a small detachment of Seckendorf occupied Crema, and the Hohenzollern forces besieged Pichigaton. Suvorov's total force numbered about 48,500 men. He was opposed by a French army of 28,000 men, consisting of 3 equal divisions, Serurier, Grenier, and Victor, and the vanguard of Lavoisier. The commander Scherer wanted to buy time for the arrival of reinforcements from Switzerland and southern Italy. The river Adda was a good defensive position, but Scherer spread his troops all along the river. Serurier was from Lecco to Trezzo. Grenier occupied the center, Victor the south. Lavoisier was at Pitzingaton. Suvorov, as it seems at first view, also scattered his troops. However, he concentrated his main forces in the center for a decisive attack. Having received information about the strong French forces in Lecco, Suvorov stopped Vukasovic and the entire Russian division to support Bagration's vanguard. On the morning of April 26th, Bagration began the assault on Lecco. Initially, the Russians were successful, but then the French counterattacked, knocked the Russians out of the city, and even began to bypass them at Germinato. General Miloradovich soon brought with him reinforcements. Miloradovich was promoted earlier than Bagration, but allowed him to finish the fight. The French were stopped, more reinforcements came up. There is some debate here. Some say Bagration was able to take Lecco but then abandoned it. Some say he was unable to take Lecco completely. Either way, Vukasovic, as he approached Brivio, discovered the weakness of this point and began to build a crossing here. The Russians withdrew to the south. 3 Cossack regiments quickly rode to the main forces of Suvorov. Historians argue about the role of the battle at Lecco in Suvorov's goals. Most likely, it was a diversionary attack to tie up the entire Serurier division in the north. Ott's division was to make a crossing at San Gervasio on the night of April 27. Along with the crossing at Trezzo, Melas was to attack the bridge fortifications at Cassano. Seckendorf in the south was ordered to cross the Adda at Lodi. That night, there was a change in the French camp. The order came from Paris to remove Scherer from the post of commander-in-chief and replace him with General Moro. Moro was one of the best generals of the Republic. Fighting spirit of the French increased greatly. Suvorov, hearing the news, said, "Here, too, I see the hand of Providence. It would be little glory to smash the charlatan. The laurels which we shall snatch from Moreau will bloom, and green better." Moreau immediately rushed from Lodi to the headquarters at Inzago. When he arrived here, he began to gather his forces. Grenier must pull his division to Vaprio and Cassano. Victor was also ordered to go to Cassano, and Lavoisier was to take Victor's position. Moreau wanted to bring Serurier too, but, hearing of the Allied crossing at Brivio, ordered Serurier to halt and take his position. On the night of April 27th, the Austrians began to build a pontoon bridge at San Gervasio. At first, there were difficulties due to the steepness of the bank, but the arriving Chatelaar successfully completed the task. There were no French posts on the shore. The battalion in Trezzo only in the morning realized his mistake when the Jaegers and hundreds of Cossacks crossed. soon began to cross the entire division of Ott, then the Cossacks' regiments. The division of Zopf was preparing. Denisov's Cossacks quickly drove the French out of Trezzo. The French fortified themselves at the villages of Vaprio and Pozzo. Grenier also began to approach there. Moro ordered Victor and Grenier to speed up the march and take a position between Pozzo and Vaprio. Ott tried to attack the French positions, but Grenier, having received reinforcements, began the offensive. He pushed Ott and threatened his right flank. At this time, Schattler arrived with reinforcements from Zopf's division and led the attack in person. This was without result. But then Denisov, gathering all three of Cossacks' regiments, attacked the left flank of the French and forced them to retreat to Pozzo. One regiment of reinforcements arrived from Milan, but the Cossacks quickly smashed it and pursued it all the way to Gorgonzola, taking a lot of prisoners. When the rest of Zopf's division approached, the Allies attacked. Both villages were taken. Finally, Moreau gave up hope of holding the position until Victor arrived and ordered Grenier to take a new position between Cassano and Inzago. Meanwhile, a small force of French were attacked by Melas's forces with such energy that many believe Suvorov was here, though it is more likely he was at Vaprio and Trezzo. The French, while fleeing, forgot to set fire to the bridge over the river. The Austrians began to move out to flank the French retreating from Vaprio. The Allies outflanked the French on both flanks. Finally, Moreau ordered a general retreat. The main road to Milan at Gorgonzola had already been cut off, so the French had to retreat rapidly through Melzo. A fierce 12-hour battle came to an end. The Austrians were exhausted. The pursuit of Moreau was carried out only by Cossacks. In the hands of the winners remained 19 guns, a standard, and more than 2,000 prisoners. The Allies lost more than 1,000 men. Suvorov broke through the enemy lines. The road to Milan was open. However, the Allies were in a pleasant surprise. Vukasovic, moving from Brivio to Milan, came across an entire division of Serurier. Serurier was following Moro's orders to stay in place to hold back Vukasovic. Communication with the commander-in-chief was now cut off. Serurier hesitated, but when Rosenberg's Russians approached, he was forced to capitulate. An entire division, approximately 2,700 men, surrendered. In total, of the 18,000 French who participated in the battle, killed and wounded were above 2,500. Up to 5,000 were taken prisoner. 27 cannon were taken. The Allied losses were no more than 2,000 men. The significance of the Battle of Cassano was enormous. The French lost Milan and with it their Cisalpine Republic. The news of the victory at Cassano delighted Vienna and St. Petersburg. After the defeat, the French retreated in two directions. Victor and Lavoisier marched to Pavia. Grenier moved through Milan to Buffalora. A small detachment of Lemoine left Pizzingaton, leaving a garrison there, crossed the Po River, and burned the bridges. After news of the battle, Milan was overcome with enthusiasm. French supporters fled the city. Allied supporters were celebrating. A garrison of 2,400 men was left in the citadel. Barely had time for the French to leave Milan as the Cossacks entered it. On the morning of April 29th, Suvorov entered the city in triumph. To the Archbishop he said, "I have been sent to restore the ancient throne of the Pope and to bring the people to serve its monarch." The Italians watched with delight how honorably the Russians treated the clergy and religion scorned by the French. These feelings were intensified as these were the days of the Christian holiday Easter. But during the entry into the city, Suvorov took a joke. He sent to ride ahead of his counselor Fuchs, which the Italians welcomed, taking for the commander-in-chief. Suvorov calmly rode behind. In Milan, Suvorov was presented to the captured officers and generals, including Serurier. Field Marshal returned him his sword. However, not in the nature of Suvorov was a long celebration. He soon began to think about new maneuvers. His first order upon entering Milan was the destruction of the Cisalpine Republic and the establishment of a provisional government until the final commands of the Vienna court. The administration of the region was transferred to Melas. He disarmed the National Guard, introduced Vienna coin, and other. Everywhere in Lombardy, the people rose up against the French. Only 2 weeks had passed since the arrival of Suvorov to the army. Now the whole situation in Italy had changed. The liberation of Piedmont was on the way. After the occupation of Lombardy, according to the thoughts of Hofkriegsrat, the Austrian Military Council, and Emperor Franz II, the main goals set for the army had been accomplished. The Austrians demanded that Suvorov's attention be focused on the siege of fortresses such as Mantua, Pizzighettone, the citadel of Milan, and others. Franz II's rescript, written under the influence of the head of the Hofkriegsrat, Tugut, cut down the strategic options of the Field Marshal. I must, however, express my wish that you, in accordance with the instruction I gave you in explanation of my thoughts before your departure from Vienna, confine your main actions to the left bank of the Po. Field Marshal worried about the possibility of movement of McDonald's army from Naples to the north. Suvorov, despite demands not to take active steps on the right bank, could not leave the possibility of the armies of Moro and McDonald to combine. Field Marshal dictated the plan to Schaedler, who was surprised at the speed with which it was drawn up. Tugut, on receiving Suvorov's plan, allowed him only to occupy some fortress on the right bank, nothing more. Suvorov's plan was as follows. Vukasovic was to cross the Ticino, go through Novara, occupy Vercelli, and send detachments to Candia and Trino, while supporting the popular liberation movement against the French. Rosenberg's Russian troops marched through Pavia, along the left bank of the Po towards Valenza, threatening the important fortress of Alessandria from the north. Bagration's vanguard crosses the Po and marches across the Voghera to Tortona, a powerful stronghold, then occupies the fortresses of Novi and Gavi, thus cutting off Moro from the French forces in Genoa. Bagration is reinforced by Zopp's and Frelich's Austrian divisions under the general command of Melas. Ott's forces were to move to Modena and, joining Austrian reinforcements from the left bank of the Po, push back the French forces of Gautier and Montrichard to the south. To cover Milan and the entire northern flank of the Allied army should troops of Prince Rogan and Strauch. Suvorov instructed Strauch to watch the pass of St. Bernard, assuming the movement of the French from there. Meanwhile, Moreau had retreated with Grenier's division to Turin, where he found the inhabitants in an excited mood, evidently disloyal to the French. Leaving General Fiorella's 3,400 men in the city, he moved with the rest of his troops towards Valenza to join Victor. The French position between Valenza and Alessandria gave two options in any case: to help Turin and to hit the rear of the enemy if he went against McDonald to the southeast. It should be understood that at first, the two commanders-in-chief did not have accurate information about each other and acted almost blindly. Bagration crossed the Po on May 5th and headed for Tortona. Approaching the fortress, he discovered the French forces, contrary to reports that Tortona was not occupied. Bagration stopped at Voghera and began to observe the French. On May 6th, the Austrians of Melas crossed. On May 9th, the Austrian troops occupied Tortona. Schaedler took an active part in this. In the hands of the French remained only the citadel. Meanwhile, the son of the Russian Emperor Konstantin Pavlovich arrived to the army. In his 20s, he was eager to get into the heat of battle. He arrived to the Rosenberg's Russian troops. Suvorov received information that Valenza was abandoned and instructed Rosenberg to take it. The troops began to build a raft to cross opposite the village of Bassignano. The Russians prepared the crossing so openly that Moreau thought it was just a demonstration and sent Grenier's main forces south. Meanwhile, Suvorov received information that Valenza occupied by the French. He immediately sent an order to Rosenberg to abandon the crossing and move to cross on the right bank to the main forces. Rosenberg received the order the moment the raft was ready. On May 12th, seeing the weakness of the French, Rosenberg still hesitated whether to cross with all the forces here. But then Constantine said to him, "I see, Your Excellency, that you are used to serve in the Crimea. It was calmer there, and you never saw the enemy in your eyes." The old and experienced General Rosenberg was insulted and ordered Chubarov's vanguard to cross. The Russians were initially successful, but Grenier's troops and Moreau himself quickly arrived. After a hard and desperate battle, the Russians began to retreat to an island formed by the Po River. French artillery inflicted terrible losses on the close ranks of the Russians on the island. The situation was made even worse by the fact that the raft was swept away by the river, and it was only possible to cross completely to the left bank after some time. The French, having suffered 600 casualties, inflicted twice as many losses on the Russians, about 1,200 men. Suvorov was furious. He ordered Rosenberg to cross on the right bank, adding a short note, without losing a minute immediately to execute this or under military court. Word soon reached him of Constantine's brave but foolish behavior in the Battle of Bassignano. He had a tough conversation with him, after which the Grand Duke left with tears in his eyes. From that moment on, Constantine fully recognized the Suvorov's authority. Meanwhile, the fortress of Pizzighitone capitulated, and Kaim's forces marched to the right bank of the Po. On May 15th, Bagration took Novi. On May 16th, Suvorov suddenly decides to transfer most of the army back to the left bank. Why? News has reached that McDonald is delayed on his way from Naples. There were even rumors that he would stay there at all. News also arrived that Lecourbe had defeated Prince Rogan in the north, threatening Lombardy. It should be added that from everywhere, Suvorov received warnings of some 20,000 reinforcements to Moro's army from France across the Alps. All this changed Suvorov's plans. He ordered Hohenzollern, who was besieging the citadel of Milan, to march with half of the forces to reinforce Prince Rogan and Strauch. On the right bank, Suvorov left the troops of Seckendorf, who was watching Moro and besieging the citadel of Tortona, and Ott, who was watching the French forces of Gautier and Montrichard in Tuscany and Modena. All other troops moved to the north. This maneuver also allowed the Allies to bypass the strong French positions at Alessandria and strike Moro in the rear. In fact, Moro did not expect any significant reinforcements. At this time, he probably thought that Suvorov, with the main forces, moved against McDonald. He decided to move Victor's division of 7,500 men in order to defeat a separate enemy corps and maintain contact with Genoa. Had he started the offensive a day later, it might have been successful. But Victor began the crossing on the morning of May 16th. He pushed the Cossacks from Marengo and headed towards San Giuliano. The Austrian camp fell into confusion. Kaim refused to lead his division into battle, referring to exhaustion after the march. Then, Lusignan energetically led his division to meet Victor. In the first battle of Marengo, all the weight of the battle lay on the Austrians, who fought well. Hearing the rumble of cannons, Bagration appeared on the battlefield, but strangely for him, did not act very actively. After a stubborn battle, Victor, having lost 500 men, retreated back across the river. Moro lost hope of making contact with Genoa through Tortona and ordered a retreat. Victor's division without cannons moved south through Acqui to the Genoese Riviera. Moro, with Grenier's division and all the wagons, retreated westward through Sheva and Kani. Suvorov, gathering a force of 30,000 men in a fist, moved on Turin. The population of Piedmont was mostly happy about the arrival of the Allies. Back in early May, Suvorov issued a proclamation to the Piedmontese troops. He urged them to join the Allies, promised the return of the King of Sardinia, deposed by the French last year. The Austrians, however, were strongly opposed to the idea. Here showed the self-interest of the Austrians, who wanted not only to return Lombardy, but also to conquer Piedmont for themselves. Suvorov wanted to recreate a Piedmontese army of up to 20,000 men. It would be very useful for garrison service. He even tried to reassure Hofkriegsrat that it could be disbanded easily. But the Austrians destroyed that idea completely. And the Sardinian king, they did not let him come to Turin at all. From this moment on, relations between the Russians and the Austrians began to deteriorate rapidly, as Emperor Paul I sent Russian troops to restore the legitimate governments. On May 21st, the fortress of Ferrara in the east capitulated, facilitating the siege of Mantua. On May 23rd, the citadel of Milan capitulated. The French were pushed out of the Graubünden region, freeing 15,000 men of Bellegarde for action in Italy. Suvorov ordered him to march on Alessandria. At that time, he also sends instructions to Ott for action against Gautier and Montrichard. Suvorov, approaching Turin, surrounded the city on three sides. Vukasovic, who was closer than the rest of the army, was in contact with the commander of the National Guard in the city, who opened the gates to him on the morning of May 26th. Fiorella and his forces were pushed back into the citadel. Suvorov entered the city in triumph. Meanwhile, the whole of Piedmont was in flames. Numerous militias were active in the country, trying to prevent Moro's retreat. When the militia occupied Trebbia, Suvorov ordered Seckendorf to send there a small detachment to hold the fortress. The force arrived in time. The French were unable to recapture Trebbia, with problems, but Moro completely retreated to the Genoese Riviera. The troops of Klenau, in contact with which Ott and his division were to act, were suddenly recalled completely to the siege of Mantua. Hofkriegsrat did this, without even wishing to inform Suvorov about it. The Field Marshal was extremely annoyed. He wrote a letter to the Russian ambassador in Vienna, Razumovsky. "If the operations are commanded by Hofkriegsrat, then I have no need here, and I now want to go home. This cabinet decree has destroyed the order of all my operations. I had to stop here for a while to correct it. McDonald is not beaten. He joins with Moro. Every private Austrian general is not by one interior, but in everything belongs to Hofkriegsrat. So he has the right to plot according to his predilections and prejudices. According to these, Hofkriegsrat from four corners has the right to command them and to bind me." In early June, McDonald's army finally appeared in northern Italy. The two French commanders began to coordinate a joint crushing blow against the Allies. One of the major crises of the campaign had arrived.
The arrival of McDonald's army put the Allies in a dangerous position. McDonald and Moro spent some time in correspondence working out a plan of joint actions. They could not unite in Genoa because at this time the roads in the mountains were difficult to pass, especially for artillery. In addition, there was no food for 50,000 men in Genoa, so McDonald had to advance to Piacenza, while Moro planned an offensive to Tortona. Then Suvorov would find himself between the two French armies, a situation that promised defeat and the loss of many gains. This plan might have worked with the average general, but the French were dealing with Suvorov. Standing with the main army at Turin, Field Marshal assumed the main attack from Genoa because of rumors of many thousands of French reinforcements arriving there, spread by Moro himself. Suvorov decided to move the army to Alessandria. On June 10th, about 22,000 Allied forces came from Turin. The troops went mostly at night. The roads were bad because of the rains. However, this did not prevent the Allies from arriving in Asti on June 11th, having covered 31 miles in just one day. After a little rest, Suvorov moved forward with the same speed and arrived in Alessandria on June 12th. Here he met with the soldiers of Bellegarde, who arrived from Switzerland. However, Suvorov was forced to send Rosenberg's Russian troops back to Asti, thanks to the Austrians, who were unable to provide food for all the troops at Alessandria. Here Suvorov had to delay, learning the situation around him and waiting for bridges to be built across the Bormida River to continue the campaign. Meanwhile, McDonald attacked Hohenzollerns' Austrian detachment at Modena, inflicting a heavy defeat on it. However, during the turmoil of the battle, McDonald himself was wounded, receiving several saber stabs. But this did not stop the French army of Naples from advancing on Parma. Moro, wanting to reinforce McDonald, sent Victor's division to Parma without cannons. Also, to keep contact with the army of Naples, he sent La Porpe's division to Bobbio. McDonald's total force, together with these two divisions, numbered about 38,000 men. In his way stood General Ott with only 6,000 men. Suvorov, having learned the details of McDonald's movement, decided to speed up the march to help Ott, so that together to smash the enemy before the appearance of Moro's army from Genoa. Rosenberg was ordered to return to Alessandria. The Great March to Trebbia was beginning. The bridges were made by evening on June 15th, and the troops began the crossing. The march was incredibly difficult. The soldiers moved with extraordinary speed. It was hot, many fell, some did not stand up anymore, but the army marched. Suvorov encouraged the troops with all his might. Arriving in Casteggio, detachment of Valetsky was sent to Bobbio to confront La Poip. By the end of June 16th, Suvorov received news that Ott was forced to abandon Piacenza. His division withdrew behind the Tidone River. The army sped up the march and arrived at the banks of the Tidone on the afternoon of June 17th, having covered 50 miles in just 36 hours. McDonald's army, without counting Lapoip at Bobbio, numbered 33 to 35,000 men. Suvorov's forces are much harder to count because of the crazy march they made. Their numbers on paper may have been equal to the French, but in reality, it was reduced much more due to marching losses. It is also important to understand that both armies concentrated at Trebbia for all 3 days of the battle, rather than arriving at once. The battle began at 8 a.m. on June 17th, when Victor's, Ruska's, Dombrowski's divisions and Salm's brigade moved against Ott's detachment. The Austrians fought well, but because of the overwhelming numbers of the French, they gradually gave ground. From the south, they were outflanked by the Poles of Dombrowski. The first to arrive on the battlefield was Melas with his forces. He organized a good defense near the village of Sarmato. The French were advancing, but the Austrians held on. Clausewitz interestingly noted that Melas held out because of fear of Suvorov. Nevertheless, at 3 p.m., the French gathered forces and attacked, taking the village. At this moment, Suvorov himself arrived with the Cossack regiments and the Austrian dragoons, which he immediately threw into action against the left and right flanks of the enemy. The dragoons sweep away Dombrowski's cavalry, and the Cossacks fall upon the infantry, shouting "Prague, Prague," referring to the capture by the Russians of these outskirts of Warsaw. In fact, the wild hatred of Suvorov for his suppression of the Polish uprising 5 years earlier energized the forces of the Poles, who fought fiercely. The Cossacks' attack bought time for the Russian infantry to arrive. Prince Bagration asked the field marshal to delay the attack, as there were not even 40 men left in his companies. Suvorov, wanting to encourage, replied, "And McDonald does not even have 20, attack with God." In total that day, Suvorov had 15,000 men. McDonald, 19,000. The terrain was terrible, numerous ditches, vineyards, and other obstacles. But Bagration delivered a strong blow to Dombrowski. After a brutal battle, the Russians again, as 5 years ago, came out victorious in the fight with the Poles. Dombrowski retreated in disorder over the Tidone River. Because of the success of the Allies in the south, the French forces on the right flank and in the center were vulnerable. The French began to retreat. The Allied cavalry, having driven Dombrowski away, rushed north and attacked the retreating Victor. Victor hastily crossed the river. McDonald himself admitted the flight of his troops from the battlefield. Suvorov was satisfied and gave the troops a long-awaited rest. McDonald withdrew most of his troops behind the Trebbia River, except Salm and Dombrowski. Having lost the initiative, he was anxiously awaiting the arrival of his two divisions, Olivier and Montrichard. Suvorov drew up a disposition for the next day, June 18th. On the right flank stood Bagration's vanguard, supported by Shveikovsky's division. In the center, Förster's division. On the left flank, Ott's division. In reserve were Freilich's forces. Rosenberg held general command over the right flank and the center. Melas commanded the left flank and the reserve. This formation was the famous oblique order of Frederick the Great. Suvorov intended to break the left flank of the enemy, cutting off the ways of communication and pressing the French to the Po River. Both rivers, Tidone and Trebbia, were passable in the ford everywhere. The Allied movement was planned to start at 7 a.m., but due to the extreme tiredness of the troops, it was delayed by 3 hours. But because of the terrible terrain, Bagration was able to attack Dombrowski at Casalegio only at 2 p.m. Two longtime enemies fought desperately, but pushed by Russian infantry from the front and by the Cossacks on the flank, the Poles were again beaten. One battalion in the south was completely surrounded and forced to surrender. But at this time, Victor's and part of Ruska's forces moved on the Russians. The French wanted to cut off Bagration from the rest of the Russian forces, but in time came the division of Shveikovsky, stabilizing the situation. Rosenberg, with some forces, rushed on the French, trying to outflank the Russian vanguard and threw them back. Meanwhile, in the center, Förster advanced. Cossacks and Austrian dragoons quickly drove back the French cavalry, and the rest of the force knocked the French out of the village of Gragnano. By evening, the divisions of Olivier and Montrichard approached Trebbia. Part of the forces of Montrichard rushed against Förster. In the south, the Russian forces finally pushed back the French behind the river Trebbia. Because of this, Montrichard also retreated. On the left flank of the Austrians easily pushed Salm's brigade out of the left bank. Melas, who had orders to send Freilich's division to help the main right flank, did not follow them. Many historians criticize this act, which deprived Suvorov of forces for a decisive blow. Darkness came. Little by little, the firefight subsided. Suddenly, 3 French battalions, for some unknown reason, went down into the river. Austrians hastily took up arms and rushed also into the river. A brutal massacre began. Men and horses mixed. Artillery fired without distinction. Soon, fortunately, this unnecessary bloodshed was stopped. However, Rosenberg's forces, in the heat of battle, crossed the river and went far to the rear of the French. Afraid of being cut off, he gathered his forces and returned back to the left bank. The French did not even notice this maneuver. June 19th, McDonald decided to launch an offensive with all his forces. A specific feature of this battle is a very large scale of the front. McDonald sent the remnants of Dombrowski's division to bypass the Russian right flank at Rivalta, thus increasing the battlefield by more than 8 miles. Victor's and Ruska's divisions were to move on Casalicio. In the center were Olivier and Montrechar, intended to attack from the front. Watrin's and Salm's forces were to outflank the Allied left wing. Just as on the previous day, Suvorov was forced to delay the beginning of the movement of the army because of the great exhaustion of the soldiers. The French were also resting for the time being. Finally, both armies came into action. Melas repelled with cannon fire the crossing of the French in the north. Noticing the movement of Dombrowski, Suvorov sent against him the vanguard of Bagration. The Poles could not withstand the rapid attack. After 3 days of battle, Polish forces were completely broken. Meanwhile, Victor and Ruska took advantage of Bagration's departure. They hit Schweikowski's division from the front and right flank. The forces were unequal. The Russians retreated to Casalicio. Here a stubborn battle started. Grenadier Rosenberg's regiment was surrounded, but courageously shot back from all sides. Despite all the bravery, the Russian troops were heavily exhausted. Rosenberg began to think about retreat. At this suggestion, Suvorov allegedly offered him to move a stone. "Can't you? Well then," and the Russians cannot retreat. At this time, the Field Marshal was also visited by Bagration, who also reported the extreme fatigue of the troops. Then Suvorov personally rushed to the troops on the right flank. Legend says that he shouted to the retreating troops, "Lure them, guys, lure, run!" He led them toward the ambush battery. When he reached it, he stopped the troops. The artillery gave a volley, and Suvorov led the troops on the offensive. The troops, very encouraged by the presence of Field Marshal, energetically rushed into the attack. At this time, in the rear of the French appeared Bagration's vanguard, which rushed into battle so rapidly that the enemy thought it was a fresh forces. Victor and Ruska could not withstand the Russian onslaught and began to retreat. Suvorov was again deprived of Freilich's reserve. Only later Melas agreed to send Liechtenstein's cavalry to the south. Division of Montrechard again began to fight with the forces of Förster at Gragnano. In the north, the rest of the French forces were also on the offensive. Liechtenstein's cavalry struck in the flank of Montrechard. After a short battle, the French wavered and then retreated. Meanwhile, Olivier's division vigorously pressed the Austrians. The situation was also saved by the brave Liechtenstein, who gathered his cavalry and hit the enemy's left flank. The Austrians, recovered from the confusion, also attacked. Olivier could not withstand the onslaught and retreated across the river. Taking advantage of the moment, the Austrians tried to cross the river, but were repulsed. Watrin's column was able to bypass far the Allied positions to the north, but due to the defeat of the main forces, also retreated to the right bank. The Allied soldiers were exhausted, many generals and officers were wounded. The situation of the French army, however, was much worse. At the end of June 19th, a council of war was assembled in Piacenza, at which all the generals were in favor of a complete retreat. The town itself was packed with wounded soldiers and officers who could not be taken away. In the morning, learning of the retreat of the enemy, the Allies crossed the Trebbia and began the pursuit. The Austrians occupied Piacenza, where they found from 4,000 to 7,000 French wounded soldiers, as well as 4 generals, Olivier, Ruska, Salm, and Cambrai. The French rearguard was commanded by Victor. In a skirmish on the Nura River, the French rearguard was defeated again. Another 1,000 men were taken prisoner. Total Allied losses at the Battle of Trebbia were between 5,000 and 6,000 men. The French lost from 16,000 to 18,000 men, most of them prisoners, 6 cannons, 7 banners, and many wagons. Thus, the army of Naples lost about half of its forces. It was a real disaster. The small Austrian detachments that had tried to block McDonald's way were driven back. General Kray, with 25,000 men, was besieging Mantua. To keep such a number of soldiers there was foolish, but he was carrying out the orders of the Hofkriegsrat not to weaken the siege of the fortress. Kray sent Suvorov to Trebbia only a handful of soldiers. Suvorov asked Kray to send a significant force to completely destroy the French. If he wanted, Kray could send to Trebbia 15,000 people to help destroy the French, and then easily justified his actions before the Hofkriegsrat. Unfortunately, however, Suvorov had strained relations with the Austrian generals. Meanwhile, Suvorov received news that Moro moved to Tortona and Alessandria with 14,000 men. He was able to defeat the forces of Bellegarde, but acted hesitantly because of the lack of communications with McDonald. Having received information that McDonald was defeated and Suvorov rushes to him, Moro began a retreat back to Genoa. It had been only 10 days since Suvorov came out of Alessandria. In that time, he marched over 130 miles, fought desperate battle for 3 days, inflicted a crushing defeat on McDonald, and turned back, scaring Moro's army away. It was a triumph of Russian banners and one of Suvorov's greatest achievements. The brilliant victory at Trebbia gave Suvorov the opportunity to focus his attention on the weakened French army in Genoa. Field Marshal drew up plans to attack Genoa from 3 sides, but the Hofkriegsrat ordered him to focus on the siege of important fortresses such as Mantua, Alessandria, and Tortona. Any offensive action Suvorov had to abandon. He felt the bitterness of being only a formal commander-in-chief. Give the French precious time to restore strength was foolish. As Suvorov said, an unfinished forest always grows. Field Marshal, irritated by the Hofkriegsrat's power over him, openly writes to Tsar Paul about it and asks for his resignation. A major siege period of the campaign had begun, lasting a month. Back on June 20th, the citadel of Turin surrendered with its extensive supplies. It strengthened the position of the Allies in Piedmont. Suvorov asked Kray to begin active actions at Mantua and ordered the siege artillery to be moved from Turin to Alessandria. This citadel was next in line. The active siege work under the fortress began in mid-July. It was accompanied by almost non-stop bombardment. On July 22nd, Alessandria was forced to capitulate. In the meantime, Kray had also become active. Mantua, that famous key to Italy, capitulated on July 28th. Some blame the garrison chief for lack of determination. The capture of Mantua made a great impression on Europe. Emperor Paul made Suvorov the Prince of Italy for his successes. It is noteworthy that Paul did not reward Kray, probably remembering his refusal to send Suvorov troops to Trebbia. By mid-July, reinforcements arrived in Italy. Almost 10,000 Russian troops of Rebender. They were stationed at Piacenza. Rosenberg took charge of these troops. The forces that had previously been at this general passed under the command of Derfelden, a Suvorov's longtime battle comrade. During the month-long sitting of the main army at Alessandria, feasts were often held there. Meanwhile, the French were gathering forces. The remnants of McDonald's army were able to unite with Moro at Genoa, transporting cannons by sea. McDonald himself and several other generals were recalled to France. Moro also lost his post. The new commander-in-chief is Joubert, a young and energetic general who earned the praise from Napoleon himself. The Directory expanded the conscription to strengthen its armies. The Army of the Alps was created under the command of Champion near the borders of Piedmont, so far numbering only 15,000 men. Joubert's army, intended for an imminent offensive, was reinforced to 45,000 men. Of the important fortresses, only Tortona continued to resist. 18,000 troops of Kray moved from Mantua to Alessandria. Thus, Suvorov had 59,000 people ready for battle. Joubert did not expect such a concentration of enemy forces and thought that in front of him scattered troops, which he will quickly crush. News of the fall of Mantua had not yet reached him. He was also forced to leave some troops in Genoa, so his forces for the offensive were reduced to 35,000. After the fall of Alessandria and Mantua, Suvorov returned to the idea of attacking Genoa. The possible movement was complicated by supply problems in the mountains. In early August, the Russian vanguard moved on Vsevolod, and after a short siege took it. However, Joubert was ahead of the Allies and rushed north. At first, he sent to Novi only the right flank of the army under the command of St. Cyr, but soon he himself moved with the left flank to this town. The two armies met on August 14th. Joubert was shocked. He was convinced of Mantua's fall when he saw Kray's troops on his left flank. In front of him stood more than 30,000 enemy troops. Together with the troops of Melas and Derfelden standing nearby, the total strength of Suvorov's army was between 44,000 and 51,000 men. The Allies had the advantage, but the French occupied a very strong defensive position on the high hills. Only the left flank of Joubert partially descended to the plain. Also, the terrain near Novi was full of vineyards and ravines. Suvorov wanted to lure the enemy to the plain, where the numerical advantage of the Allies, especially in cavalry, would prove decisive. But Joubert, confused by the unexpected masses of Allied troops, hesitated. He did not dare to give the order to retreat, hoping that at night the enemy will retreat. But Suvorov was not going to do this. The whole day of August 14th, he waited for the French to come down from the ridge on the plain. This did not happen, so he decided to attack them early in the morning of August 15th. The right flank of the French army was composed of Watren's and Dombrowski's divisions, the latter besieging Vsevolod. Lavoisier's division and Calais' brigade occupied Novi and the heights west of it. On the left flank stood the troops of Lemoine and Grouchy. Behind Pasturana was the reserve of Clausel and Partuno. The right flank of the Allied army was composed of the Austrian divisions of Ott, Bellegarde, and a small detachment of Seckendorf under the overall command of Kray. At Pozzolo Formigaro stood the troops of Bagration and Miloradovich. Early in the morning, at 5 a.m., Kray energetically attacked the French left flank. Initially, only Lemoyne's division was ready for battle. Grouchy had only just begun to line up his troops. Hearing a skirmish on his left flank, Joubert rushed there and was immediately mortally wounded by a bullet. General Moro, who had been with the army, took command. Joubert's death was concealed from the troops until the end of the battle. The Austrians initially advanced well and almost took the heights, but Moreau arrived and restored order among his troops. Clausel's reserve appeared and the French held the heights. The Austrian advance was halted. The battle had already lasted 3 hours, and the rest of the Allied troops remained standing still. Kray sent an adjutant to Prince Bagration, urging him to attack. However, the prince continued to wait for Suvorov's instructions. It is worth mentioning that many circumstances of the battle remain unclear, especially in the field of actions, plans, and thoughts of the field marshal. Suvorov gave Bagration the order to attack Novi only at 9 a.m. Miloradovich was also sent to support the Russian vanguard. The offensive was brave. Even the French praised the Russians. Despite the bravery of the attack, the Russians were unable to take the city. The enemy's position was too strong. The Russians retreated with heavy losses. Suvorov immediately sent orders to Melas, Derfelden, and Rosenberg as quickly as possible to go to the battlefield. The French came out of the city and hit Bagration's right flank. Watrin's troops also appeared, moved closer to Novi. For Suvorov, the appearance of Watrin was a complete surprise, as he had no information on its location before. A desperate fight ensued, and General Förster was able to push Watrin back. At this time, Bagration again launched an attack on Novi. The enemy was bringing in his reserves. The second attack on Novi was also repulsed. The French again came out of the city and began to threaten the right flank of the Russians. But then arrived troops of Derfelden, reinforcing the Russian left flank. The Allies went on the offensive. Watrin's forces retreated and took cover behind the ridge. More attacks followed. The Russians showed incredible bravery, but the French position was impregnable. The Russian attacks crashed like waves against the rocks. Meanwhile, Melas moved to the battlefield, who was criticized by many for slow progress. At 1 p.m., Suvorov ordered to stop the bloody attacks. On the Allied right flank, Kray's second offensive at 9 a.m. began quite successfully. Ott's force was climbing the heights. Bellegarde knocked down the left flank of Grouchy and headed for Pasturana, threatening the enemy's lines of retreat. But the French again strained all their forces. The reserves of Clausel and Partuno went on the counterattack. The Austrians were forced to retreat. However, the French were careless in pursuit of the enemy and lost several battalions. General Partuno was taken prisoner. By 1 p.m., the battle had quieted down on the entire battlefield. Both armies were exhausted by the long struggle, but the French used all their forces, while Suvorov still had a powerful reserve. Milan was ordered to attack the right flank of the enemy. At 4 p.m., Suvorov resumed the offensive with all his forces. The Austrians of Milan pressed the forces of Turin. The Russians, after a stubborn struggle, was finally able to take Novi. The path of retreat to Gavi was already cut off by the Allies. By 6 p.m., the French were already in full retreat, which quickly turned into a disorderly rout. Kray's troops had driven the French left flank down from the heights. The enemy had no other way of retreat but the road through Pastorana. In this village, all the troops of the left flank quickly piled up. They were to march along the narrow road. The Austrians occupied the heights above the road. Unexpected shots from them threw the French into a state of utter chaos. The French fled, each trying to save himself. Generals Colli, Grouchy, and Perignon were taken prisoners. In the hands of the victors remained a huge convoy. Of the entire French army, only part of the right flank of St. Cyr retained some semblance of order. This fierce battle lasted 16 hours. It was perhaps the most difficult victory of Suvorov in his career. Allied losses numbered about 8,000 men, mostly Kray's Austrians. French losses ranged from 9,500 to 11,000 men, 6 banners, 37 cannons. In this battle, Suvorov again showed his tenacity, reaching stubbornness. The French fought excellently, but the iron will of the Field Marshal defeated them. When news of the victory at Novi reached Emperor Paul, he generously rewarded all the heroes of the battle. He issued a decree: in gratitude for the deeds of Prince of Italy, Count Suvorov Rimnitsky, the guards and all Russian troops, even in the presence of the emperor, to give him all military honors, similar to those given to the person of His Imperial Majesty. Few have ever deserved such respect. Moro retreated to Genoa, where the population was extremely agitated. He wanted to leave the city, but never dared to take responsibility for it. To the surprise of the French, the Allies did not pursue the enemy. Why? Suvorov was ready to launch an offensive, but he was reported that there was no food or mules for movement in the mountains. Yes, even now the Austrians failed to prepare everything necessary. Not to pursue the enemy meant giving up the fruits of victory. Suvorov was forced to delay the offensive for the time being. Meanwhile, Klenau with 9,000 men was advancing on Genoa along the coast from the east, according to the original plan of Field Marshal. Suddenly, Klenau received orders from the Hofkriegsrat to stop the offensive and return to Tuscany. Orders also came to Melas to gather forces to disarm the popular militias in central Italy. Throughout the campaign, these militias proved themselves very well. Suvorov foresaw that this order would turn the population, so far favorable to the Allies, against them. Russian Colonel Zucato, who was training the militias in Tuscany, quickly left to avoid meeting the Austrian demands and to preserve Russian honor in the eyes of the Italian people. Suvorov begged the Hofkriegsrat to allow an offensive. It never happened. Suvorov wrote to Count Rostopchin, "Everything is not nice to me. Sent every minute from the Hofkriegsrat commands weaken my health, and I cannot continue to serve here. They want to rule for thousands of versts, do not know that every minute on the spot makes them change." Many criticized Suvorov for not pursuing the French after the victory at Novi. In fact, the Field Marshal himself was the most grieved about it. Meanwhile, he received news that the troops of Rogan and Strauss in Switzerland attacked by the enemy and pushed back to Bellinzona. But the French did not continue the offensive. Suvorov reinforced his northern flank with troops of Kray. Taking into account the threat from the army Champion, Suvorov moved the main army to Asti. Siege work began at Tortona. Having learned of the defeat at Novi, the garrison offered the Allies a truce for 4 weeks, and if the French did not lift the siege, the garrison would capitulate. Suvorov agreed, but reduced the term to 20 days. Suddenly, Kray received orders to move quickly towards the main army. Klenau's detachment, despite the orders of the Hofkriegsrat, continued the offensive, and very successfully. But Moro, having concentrated his forces, launched a counterattack. Suffering defeat and also receiving orders from Melas to retreat to Tuscany, Klenau did it. The possibility of an offensive into Genoa lay in ruins now. In his camp at Asti, Suvorov received many signs of appreciation from the Italians. His authority after the victory at Novi increased greatly throughout Europe. deputation from the city of Turin presented Suvorov's sword with diamonds. King Charles Emmanuel of Sardinia made Suvorov Field Marshal of the Piedmontese troops, gave him the title of Prince and Brother, Cousin. Tsar Paul allowed the Field Marshal to accept these honors. Suvorov in 1799 reached the peak of his popularity. Even in England, he gained glory. Of course, many caricatures came out in the English style, but many see a positive connotation in them. Suvorov's name was also transferred to fashion. The most famous are boots a la Suvorov. This man liberated Italy from the French in less than 6 months. You can imagine the gloomy mood of the Italians when the news broke that Suvorov with all Russian troops was leaving Italy and moving to Switzerland. Suvorov was about to face probably the most difficult challenge of his life. After the brilliant victories in Italy, political games moved Suvorov to the mountains of Switzerland. Here he leads a campaign, which, as Clausewitz put it, has no equal in all military history, and by its difficulty and endurance shown in it, bordering with almost unbelievable. A campaign that destroyed Russia's relations with its allies and allowed Russian soldiers and Suvorov to enter historical immortality. By the end of the summer of 1799, relations between Russia and its allies, especially Austria, were very strained. Paul, as a kind of knight, considered the war with France ideologically important, but gradually he realized that the Allies were using the Russians as cannon fodder to achieve their selfish goals. Austria had conquered Italy. England wanted to get rid of its longtime rival, the Holland's navy. The English wanted to seize those ships or destroy them. Under the guise of fighting the revolution, England persuaded Paul to take part in a joint Holland expedition. That worried the Austrians since they had ruled the area before France took it away. In addition, neither England nor Austria wanted to strengthen Russian influence in Italy, so they wanted to withdraw Suvorov's army from there. Using the French siege of Philipsburg as an excuse, the Hofkriegsrat ordered Archduke Charles to immediately withdraw all his troops from Switzerland. The positions held by his 60,000-strong army were supposed to be held by Korsakov's Russian army, which arrived in mid-August and numbered only 27,000 men. They were facing, according to various estimates, from 60 to 70,000 troops under the command of one of the best generals of France, Massena. Realizing the dangerous situation in which he puts the Russians, Archduke Charles, on his own initiative, left in Switzerland 22,000 Austrians under the command of Hatzi, which were to stand until the arrival of Suvorov. The field marshal received orders for a general movement of troops at the end of August. At the same time, the Archduke began to withdraw his troops. Suvorov was surprised by the actions of the Austrians. Archduke Charles, throughout his standing in Switzerland, having a numerical advantage, not only failed to smash the French, but now put the Russians in a very dangerous position. Charles's indecisive actions some assessed as cowardice. Thus, Suvorov began to prepare for the upcoming campaign. He was forced to delay a little due to the French advance to lift the siege of Tortona. Moro quickly retreated as soon as he learned of the field marshal's return. The garrison of Tortona surrendered on September 11th. On the same day, the Russian troops marched northward. Arriving at Taverno, Suvorov again discovered the incompetence of the Austrians. They were supposed to provide the Russians 1,400 mules for supplies transportation. However, nothing was ready. After a few days, only 650 mules were delivered. Suvorov ordered the use Cossacks' horses for this purpose, and the Cossacks themselves were to act as light infantry. Suvorov's main goal is to link up with the troops of Korsakov and Hatza. Korsakov located his main forces at Zurich, having advanced posts at the river Limmat. Hatza's troops were divided into 3 groups. One, under Hatza's personal command, stood between Lake Zurich and Lake Wallenstedt. Jelicich's troops were between the towns of Wallenstedt and Sargans. The third group, commanded by Lincoln, was moved towards Ilanz and was closest to Suvorov. Lecourb's division formed the right flank of Massena's army. Gudin's brigade occupied the St. Gotthard Pass. Lecourb himself, with the men of Loison, occupied Altdorf. Molitor's brigade guarded the crossings of the river Linta between Neffels and Glarus. In front of Hatza stood Solt. Massena concentrated his main forces against the Korsakov's troops. The Allied plan was as follows. Suvorov goes through Airolo, St. Gotthard Pass, Amsteg to Altdorf. Here he marches by road to Schwyz. Austrian troops attack the enemy. The Austrians cross the river Linta, smash Molitor, and go to join Suvorov to Schwyz. Thus, there would be an opportunity to reach the rear of Massena's army. Troops Korsakov had to support the general offensive and cross the Limmat. Austrian headquarters also considered the option of moving Suvorov's army to the northeast through Alans Kur. But this way required more time, which the Allies didn't have. Suvorov was eager to connect as quickly as possible with the rest of the forces. However, the Austrian headquarters made one important mistake, which will be discussed further. Meanwhile, Massena, taking advantage of Archduke Charles's withdrawal from Switzerland, planned to strike Korsakov and Hatza. It is important to understand that neither Suvorov nor Massena knew anything about each other's plans. Intelligence was too bad. Only before the beginning of his offensive on Zurich, Massena began to receive vague news about the Russian troops at St. Gotthard. On September 21st, Suvorov began to move north. At Biasco, the army divided into two parts. Suvorov knew that the French position on the pass of St. Gotthard is strong. Therefore, he prepared two strikes on it. Two-thirds of the army under the command of Derfelden go through Airolo and storm St. Gotthard from the front. This column was also supported by Strauch's Austrian brigade. A third of the force under the command of Rosenberg took a longer route, outflanking the French, through Descentes to the Urzern Valley. The Russians met the harsh conditions of mountain warfare without any experience. Rosenberg's movement in particular was uneasy. For several days, heavy rains worried the army. Rain, slippery roads, and steep descents and ascents slowed Rosenberg's column. On September 23rd, these forces reached Descentes. Here they were met by the Austrian Brigade of Auffenberg, which was sent by Lincoln to reinforce Suvorov. Auffenberg was sent to Amsteg to cut off the French retreat. On September 24th in the afternoon, the main Russian column reached the French position at Airolo. A narrow path rose from this village, crossed the rivers several times, descending to them, and then rising again. To shackle the enemy forces and give time to Rosenberg's forces to appear at Urzern, Suvorov ordered to launch an attack from the front by three columns. The right column of Rosenberg and Schweikovsky had to outflank the French left flank using extremely difficult mountain path. The other two columns were to move directly through the St. Gotthard Pass. At 2 p.m., Bagration's troops attacked the French forward posts at Airolo, which after weak resistance began to retreat. The right column engaged in a hot battle at the foot of the mountains. Such enemy resistance did not stop the movement of the Russians, and Bagration began to climb the mountains. Meanwhile, the French were attacked at the Sorachia River and continued their slow retreat. The French defended stubbornly. They, hidden behind the rocks and ravines, by skillful fire inflicted heavy losses on the Russians. The enemy defended every step. Gudin received reinforcements from La Courbe and took up a strong position ahead of Gospis. The Russian troops bravely launched an attack, but were repulsed with heavy losses. But the presence of Grand Duke Constantine and Suvorov himself encouraged the troops, who continued the fight. Bagration's column, meanwhile, was climbing from rock to rock with great effort. The Allied army was exhausted. At 4 p.m., Suvorov began the third general attack against the enemy's position. Finally, Bagration appeared on top of the mountains at the French left flank. The enemy did not expect the appearance of the Russians from this direction and was extremely surprised. Gudin began a hasty retreat to the village of Hospital. This crossing, says Clausewitz, causes the greatest astonishment, and it is the most amazing of feats during the whole Suvorov's campaign. The Russians finally took St. Gotthard. Suvorov gave the troops time to rest and then began to descend the mountain. In the meantime, La Courbe arrived at the hospital with the main forces. But then the French commander received information about the approach of Rosenberg's column. On the road from Descentes to Urzern, Rosenberg met two French battalions. The French were used to warfare in Switzerland and perfectly used the terrain. They resisted stubbornly against Rosenberg, but were eventually driven back. That column approached the descent to the village of Urzern. Rosenberg was cautious, looking from the heights of our days apparently unnecessary, and did not attack the enemy immediately. Rosenberg's Russian troops began to descend towards Urzern later in the evening. A thick fog was hiding the French troops. The Russians quickly descended to the plain, gave a rifle volley, and rushed into a bayonet attack. The French, who had not expected an attack, met the Russians bravely, but were crushed. Fog and night darkness saved the retreating enemy from pursuit. Rosenberg stayed at Urzern, where he found a large amount of food and ammunition. Meanwhile, Suvorov's troops with a fight-occupied hospital. Lecourbe, realizing that the path of retreat through Urzern was lost, ordered a general retreat to the west. Suvorov won his first victory in the brutal mountain war, but it was achieved with a heavy price. The Russians lost over 1,400 men. French losses are difficult to determine, but they were obviously much less. Faced with a war in the Alps, the Russians apparently experienced something like a thrill. The plains of Italy were left behind them. Narrow road through a narrow valley, rocky walls of the mountains, the endless climb uphill made an unpleasant impression. However, Suvorov's voice encouraged the troops during all the difficulties. North of Urzern, the road on the right bank of the river is blocked by huge rocks. A narrow hole called the Urzern Hole, or Urner Lock, was pierced through this natural barrier. The passage was 80 steps long and a few steps wide. This road leaves the hole, circles the mountain, and descends to the famous Devil's Bridge. 20 meters below the bridge flows the Resa River with turbulent waterfalls. The position was very strong. On the morning of September 25th, Suvorov's army moved towards the enemy. The first attempt to pass through the hole ended in failure. The Russians were met with accurate fire. Then some forces were sent to move to the left bank and outflank the French. The soldiers bravely overcame the steep descent, crossed the turbulent stream of the river, and climbed up on the bank. This appearance scared the French, and they destroyed one arch of the bridge. But the Russians found a way out. They dismantled the nearby house for travelers and tied the boards with scarves. It turned out to be a perfect temporary crossing. The French were forced into a hasty retreat. Meanwhile, to the north, Auffenberg's Austrian brigade came to Amsteg and quickly occupied the town. But then Lecourbe's main force came up and just as quickly knocked the Austrians out of Amsteg. The French continued their retreat to Altdorf. Suvorov pursued them. On September 26th, the Russians engaged in a skirmish with Lecourbe's advanced posts in front of Altdorf. But the French commander did not dare to test his fate and quickly crossed to the left bank of the Risa. In the town, the Russians found some supplies of food and ammunition, so needed for the army. Arriving in Altdorf, Suvorov saw with his own eyes the terrible mistake in which his Austrian headquarters involved him. The road from here to Schwyz did not exist. Men got to Schwyz back then only by water, but the French seized all the boats. How could such an important detail have been overlooked? No wonder that the future compiler of the Allied plan at Austerlitz-Weirother took part in drawing up a plan for the movement of Suvorov's army. We must give Suvorov credit. He did not rely only on staff officers. He wrote to Austrian generals, Hotze, Jellachich, Lincoln, who were familiar with the terrain, with a request to report on the possible difficulties of the path. And none of them informed the Field Marshal about the non-existent road from Altdorf to Schwyz. Betrayal is unlikely. It is not favorable to the Austrians, but then it's just staggering incompetence. At Altdorf, the army was in a poor condition. They were exhausted from the extraordinary crossings and were on the verge of starvation. All the food they had carried with them was almost gone, and supply wagons could not catch up with the army and stretch from Erolo to Altdorf. Suvorov was deeply worried about the fate of Korsakov and Hotze, who would have been surely defeated if he had retreated. He did choose to do so. He decided to advance. But how? Here lay the path over the Kinzig Pass to the Mutten Valley. It was only for the inhabitants, not for the army. But Suvorov chose this path. He had to go along such a footpath, on which perhaps no army has ever set foot since wars have been fought. The fact that Suvorov demanded this of his army in the exhausted state in which it arrived at Altdorf was testimony to the incredible strength of will of the commander, and that he got it from her was proof of Suvorov's remarkable power over the spirit of his troops. Without a day's rest, the army began to cross Kinzig on the morning of September 27th. Gradually, the path became steeper and narrower, and in some places it disappeared on the rocks. The troops had to climb one by one, then on bare rocks, then on slippery clay. In some places, they had to climb on a kind of stairway where the soles of their feet could not even stand. In other places, the stones crumbled because of a careless step. Then the soldiers had to get stuck in the loose snow that covered the top of the ridge. It was hard to climb such a mountain on foot. Horses and mules loaded with cannons and ammunition suffered much worse. The poor animals could hardly move their legs, often fell off the narrow path, flew down and crashed on the rocks. It happened that they dragged men with them. Each step cost a life. The path was 10 miles long. The army moved slowly, leaving a terrifying trail of dead men and animals along the way. The army's rearguard arrived at Muttental only on the evening of September 28th, and the wagons stretched for 2 more days. Bagration, descending into the valley, found a small French post in the village of Muttental. The Russians quickly knocked it out, and the enemy retreated to Schwyz. Some historians are surprised by the passiveness of the usually energetic Lecourbe. Why didn't he attack the Russian rearguard with all his forces? Suvorov once said, "Surprise the enemy means victory." Lecourbe couldn't believe that Suvorov's army will go this way. In the end, the Russian rearguard repulsed only 1 weak attempt by the French to cross the river and then moved freely to the Mutten Valley. In the Mutten Valley, rumors began to reach Suvorov, which were soon confirmed that Massena had inflicted a heavy defeat on Korsakov at Zurich. To the east, Soult crossed the Linta and defeated Hatz's troops. Hatza himself died in the battle. Jelatich's column attempted to cross the Linta at Neffels, but was defeated and began to retreat. Lincoln's troops, who were advancing from the south, from Ilans, pushed the French back as far as Glarus. But after receiving news of defeats on other fronts, Lincoln also began to retreat. Massena received news of Suvorov's movement and began to concentrate his forces against him. The main French forces arrived at Schwyz. Molitor's troops were closing the passage to the east for the Russians. Go back through the Kinzig pass was impossible. Lecourbe's forces were ready to fight. Suvorov was completely surrounded. The Russians were on the verge of disaster. How will Suvorov get out of this? Evening of September 28, 1799. Suvorov in the Mutten Valley learns of the terrible situation of his army. French forces under the command of Massena began to concentrate against him. Massena went in person through Lucerne to Altdorf to Lecourbe, where, however, they found nothing but sad traces of retreat in the form of dead or dying men and animals. The French commander then rushed to Schwyz, taking with him some of Lecourbe's forces. So at Schwyz, Massena would concentrate between 11,000 and 15,000 men in the next few days. Lecourbe's division numbered about 5,000 men. Molitor's forces, reinforced by Soult's division, numbered 5,500 men. The situation for the Russians was made even worse by the fact that Emperor Paul's son, Constantine, was present with the army. He could not be allowed to be taken prisoner. It was simpler to die, but even a fool can die. Suvorov must get the army out of the encirclement. The Allied army in the Mutten Valley was in a tired condition. The soldiers were having trouble finding food to eat. But despite this, the inhabitants of the valley spoke well of the Russians. Franz Betschart writes that they could sell cheese to the Russians for 15 shillings a pound, while the French and Austrians, and even their neighbors from Glarus, were stealing and robbing. Similarly, in the minutes of the Muttenthal convent, the abbess wrote, "The Russians paid for almost everything they took, except the fee for the maintenance of the wounded. The Austrians and French have paid nothing." The Commissioner Fassbin also speaks very well of the Russians and says that they robbed only when the inhabitants of the Muthenian Valley asked them to pay 3 times the price. On September 29th, Suvorov decided to gather in the Muttental Monastery Military Council. Only Russians were invited. One of the participants of the campaign recalled from Bagration's words, "Prince Bagration came first to Suvorov and found him in great excitement. In full field marshal's uniform, and in all the orders, he walked with quick steps around the room, and without even noticing the arrival of Prince Bagration, curtly said to himself, 'Parades, great respect for yourself. Turns around, hats off. Yes, and it is necessary. And what is more necessary is to know how to fight a war, to know the terrain, to be able to calculate, not to deceive yourself, to be able to strike, to kill so many thousands. And what thousands? In one day. God have mercy.'" Obviously, Suvorov spoke with Emperor Paul about the Battle of Zurich. All together entered the field marshal's room. Suvorov stopped, made a bow, closed his eyes, and seemed to gather his thoughts. After a moment's silence, he suddenly looked over everyone with his quick, fiery eyes and began to speak solemnly, strongly, with enthusiasm. Korsakov is defeated and driven beyond the Rhine. Gotzi is missing and his corps is scattered. Yelisich and Lincoln are gone. Our whole plan is scattered. He blamed the Austrians for everything. We are now among the mountains, surrounded by an enemy who is superior in strength. What shall we do? To go back is shameful. Never yet have I retreated. To go forward to Schwyz is impossible. Messina has over 60,000, and we have not even 20. Besides, we have no provisions, no ammunition, no artillery. We have no one to help us. We are on the edge of destruction. Now there is only one hope in the Almighty God, and in the bravery and selflessness of our troops. We are the Russians. God is with us. Save the honor of Russia and the Emperor. Save the son of our Emperor. With these words, he threw himself at the feet of the Grand Duke Constantine and burst into tears. General Derfelden was the first to speak on behalf of all the Russian commanders. He vouched for the unfailing courage and unquestioning self-sacrifice of the army, which was ready to go without complaint wherever the great commander would lead them. As a result, it was decided not to go to Schwyz, but to move through Mount Progel to the Klental Lake, Glarus to join the Austrians. Offenburg's vanguard moved in this direction already on September 29th. The advance of Derfelden's forces was planned for the next day. General Rosenberg was entrusted to command the army's rearguard. Suvorov ordered him to hold back the French at any cost from the direction of Schwyz. During this time, all the wagons were supposed to cross the Progel. September 30th, Massena decides to make a reconnaissance of the enemy's positions with all his forces, about 8,000 men. Rosenberg had from 4,000 to 5,000 men. In the morning, French patrols came across the advanced Russian posts. A firefight started, but soon everything calmed down. Rosenberg's troops stood quietly all morning. Rosenberg himself with 3 regiments stood camped near the village of Muttental. General Rebender with his regiment, 1 battalion of Jaegers and 2 infantry Cossacks regiments stood in the vanguard on the left bank of the Mura River. A mile and a half to the west stood the Jaegers and several hundred cavalry Cossacks. The advanced posts were commanded by Major Sabanayev. The other 3 regiments were still crossing the Kinzig Pass and had not yet descended into the valley. Around 2 p.m., Mortier's troops attacked Sabanayev's advanced posts. The Russian Jaegers, shooting back from the thick masses of the French, began to retreat to Rebender's forces, which had begun their movement. Encountering the enemy columns with rifle volleys and grape shot, the Russian battalions rushed into a bayonet attack. 6 times the Russians attacked, and 6 times they were repulsed. The forces of Rosenberg's vanguard were exhausted. At this time, a fresh French column came up and forced them to retreat. 1 Russian cannon lagged behind the main line, and the French killed the artillerymen and captured the cannon. Then Rebender jumped to his battalions and shouted to them, "Guys, the cannon has been taken from us! Forward!" Hearing this, the whole line rushed again with bayonets, pushed the enemy with fury, recaptured their cannon, and captured French howitzer. The stubborn battle had already lasted more than 2 hours when the other 3 regiments finally arrived to reinforce the vanguard. They moved through the first line. These troops bravely rushed into bayonet attack and quickly began to push the enemy, while the Cossacks were disturbing the French flanks. The enemy's forces could not withstand the onslaught and began to retreat. As the valley gradually became constricted by the mountains, the French had to roll up in a single column. The road then crossed a bridge to the left bank of the river. The Cossacks, eager to chase the French, crossed the river and rushed toward the enemy's rearguard. The French were quickly routed. Only the darkness put an end to the pursuit. The Russians withdrew to their former positions. Only 1 regiment with Cossacks was brought forward. This was the first day of the Battle of the Mutten Valley. Massena was preparing for the second day. After the heavy fighting, the Russians suffered a severe shortage of food. Some were lucky to find something from the lying French. Massena received reinforcements, which strengthened the French army to 15,000 men. Rosenberg's forces also grew by the arrival of the remaining regiments and now numbered about 7,000 men. October 1st, morning. The French troops moved into the Mutten Valley. At 11 a.m., they attacked the advanced Russian posts. The Russian forward posts were ordered not to engage in a stubborn fighting with the enemy, but to retreat, luring him to the open plain. Massena led the attack in 3 columns, 2 on the right bank, the 3rd on the left. Soon the entire Russian army was lined up in 2 lines. Rosenberg rode along the troops and encouraged them, ordering them not to waste time on skirmishing and fight with bayonets, as Suvorov taught. The first line split up and took position on the flanks, while the second line moved forward. The French were not confused, seeing a formidable enemy, and moved in 2 lines on the offensive. But suddenly a terrible volley bombarded the French with a hail of bullets and grape shot. The whole Russian line, with a cry of "Hurrah!" rushed into bayonet attack. The French stopped, hesitated, opened a rapid fire. The Russians broke swiftly into the first enemy line. After a brief fight, the French were unable to withstand it. They run away. The second enemy line tried to stop this onslaught, but was also knocked down by Russian bayonets. The entire French forces fled the battlefield in disorder. The French had taken into account all the difficulties of retreating from the plain across the bridge the previous day, and so built fortifications in front of it. While the main troops were rushing across the bridge, the French rear guard took up a strong position covering this escape. This position was covered on the left flank by mountains and on the right by a river. A battery of 5 cannons also protected the road. A small Russian column climbed the mountains, came to the left flank of the enemy, and attacked him. At this time, the rest of the troops were advancing from the front. The French rear guard was crushed. All the guns were captured by the Russians. The Cossacks pursued the fleeing French for a long time, cutting them down and taking them prisoner. The French withdrew to Schwyz and began to prepare for defense. One Russian column even reached the town of Brunnen near Lake Lucerne, but quickly retreated to the main forces. Thus ended the Battle of the Mutten Valley, a brilliant victory over Massena himself. French losses were up to 3,000 men and 6 cannon. Russian losses were less than 1,000 men. On the morning of September 29th, Auffenberg's brigade crossed Mount Pragel and faced Molitor's battalion. The Austrians quickly pushed back the French, but Molitor brought reinforcements. By the end of the day, the French had managed to gain a foothold on the western edge of Lake Klenthal. Molitor had a total of 5,500 men, but they were scattered from Klenthal to Molis. Auffenberg's forces and Bagration soldiers, who approached on September 30th, numbered about 4,000 men. These forces also received some reinforcements from Schweikovsky's division, which was marching behind. On the morning of September 30th, Molitor began the offensive. Auffenberg held back the onslaught, and a sluggish skirmish continued until evening, when Bagration arrived. He began to outflank the French left flank, and Molitor retreated to the eastern edge of the lake. During the night, the Russians climbed the mountains to threaten the enemy's right flank. On the morning of October 1st, the general attack began. The Allied onslaught from the front and flank was unstoppable. Molitor began a hasty retreat to Netztal. Here he took up a new position. The Russians were able to cut him off from 2 battalions of reinforcements from Glarus, which then crossed the Linta and moved to Molis. Molitor could not withstand the new Allied attack, and pursued by Bagration, began moving towards Neffels. Before that, he burned the bridge at Netztal. But it didn't stop the Russians. A stubborn and brutal battle ensued at Neffels and Molis. After tenacious and brave resistance by the French, both villages were taken by the Russians, but Molitor received fresh reinforcements from Soult's division. By evening, the French were able to retake Neffels and Molis. Both sides were exhausted. It's hard to talk about casualties in this battle. Both sides may have lost up to 2,000 men. Suvorov was able to break the ring of encirclement, taking Glarus. Here he will remain until October 5th. Many are surprised by such inactivity of energetic Suvorov. Some claim that he waited for Rosenberg's rearguard. Some point out the miserable condition of his army. The troops were exhausted, hungry, they lacked ammunition, artillery is badly weakened. All this probably influenced this stopping and abandoning the idea of going through Molis to Sargans. The Russians didn't know the exact strength of the enemy in the north. Also, the fate of Roseburg was unknown, and in case of defeat of the Russian rearguard, Massena could go to the rear of Suvorov. The army was also weakened by the Auffenberg's departure for unknown reasons through the Panix Pass to the Lincoln's force. Thus, at a council of war on October 4th, it was decided not to march to fight its way north, but instead to march south to Elance. The army's movement began on the morning of October 5th. The command of the Russian rearguard was entrusted to Bagration, who was able to hold back the French forces. Molitor, after a short pursuit, stopped his troops. The Russian army, which was already in a terrible condition, had to cross the Panix Pass. This pass was more difficult than St. Gotthard's, but nevertheless passable. But in these days, suddenly deep snow fell. It meant that the Russians would have to do a crazy crossing again, but fortunately, the last one. The narrow road, which could only be traveled singly, lay for the most part on the edges, with a chasm below. The higher one climbed, the steeper and more difficult the ascent became. Often clouds blocked visibility, and the soldiers moved almost blindly. Huge rocks rolled down into the chasms with a rumble. The remaining cannons had to be thrown down, all without distinction. Soldiers, officers, generals were barefoot, hungry, exhausted, wet to the bone. Some made a wrong step and fell with the stones. With the onset of darkness, people lay down anywhere, on snow, stones, leaning against a rock. To all the horrors of the night, the cold came. Some soldiers froze. The road became slippery. The descent down the mountain was also difficult, with men literally sliding down a 30-degree slope. Probably about 200 men died during this crossing. Finally, on October 7th, the Russians reached Elance, where they got a long-awaited rest. The next day they moved to Kur, where they found large supplies of food. The army's joy had no limit. This is how Suvorov's Swiss campaign ended. Army's losses are difficult to determine, but according to formation reports, the number of the army on September 12th was equal to 21,285 men. By October 12th, it was reduced to 16,054 men. Accordingly, on paper, the losses amounted to 5,231 men. Most likely, the real losses were higher. However, we do not know exactly. Therefore, the losses of Suvorov's army amounted to about 25%. Undoubtedly, this campaign resulted as a defeat for the Allies. Massena's victory at Zurich decided its outcome. But Suvorov's fault in the defeat is minimal. His actions were brilliant. Finding himself completely surrounded in the Mutten Valley, he was able to turn the Massena's main forces into a panic rout from the battlefield. With his other hand, he defeated Molitor and led the army out of the encirclement. Suvorov won all the fights. There are very few generals who would have been able to lead an army out under such conditions. Napoleon could, Wellington probably could too, but a less talented general would have been forced to surrender or would have been destroyed. Anyway, this strategic defeat led to the collapse of the alliance between Russia and Austria. In these days, Suvorov received rescripts from Emperor Paul, which ordered him to prepare, in case of breaking the alliance with Austria, to withdraw back to Russia. Paul's final decision took place on October 22nd, when he received news from Switzerland. He attributed the failure at Zurich to the fault of the Austrians because of the withdrawal of their troops. Also, the Russian secret advisor in Vienna, Kolyshev, literally demanded from the head of the Hofkriegsrat, Tugut, explanations for the occupation policy in Italy. The Austrians avoided answering. Paul wrote to Emperor Franz, "Seeing that my troops have been abandoned for sacrifice to the enemy by that ally on whom I relied more than on any other, seeing that his policy is completely opposed to my interests, and that the salvation of Europe has been sacrificed to the desire to spread your monarchy, I now declare that I shall henceforth cease to care for your benefits and shall attend to my own." When the Austrians received this letter in early November, they were confused. Some thought that Paul would not execute the threat. Suvorov foresaw these events and had already retreated to Augsburg, where he received a letter ordering him to return to the motherland. It ended with the phrase, "You had to save the Tsars. Now save the Russian soldiers in the honor of your sovereign." The return to Russia began. Emperor Franz wrote to Suvorov asking him to delay the retreat, but the field marshal carried out the will of his sovereign. On his return to Russia, Suvorov received great marks of honor from Paul. He was given the rank of generalissimo. Suvorov was the fourth person in Russian history to hold this rank. The next and the last generalissimo was Stalin. Paul ordered a monument to be built to the generalissimo. It was the first monument in the history of Russia to be erected to someone who was not a czar. It was opened in 1801. But Paul had a difficult and changeable character. During his reign, a man could for a short time fly to the top of the career ladder and then just as quickly fall to the bottom. So it also happened with Suvorov. As soon as Suvorov, who fell seriously ill on the way, entered Russia, Paul made a reprimand to him about a trifle that did not seem to be very important. Konstantin Pavlovich said that his father became envious of Suvorov's fame. The envy appeared also to other participants of the campaign. He forbade Suvorov to enter St. Petersburg in the daytime. Severely ill Alexander Vasilievich entered the city only at night. The second and the last disgrace began. No one dared to visit Suvorov on their own initiative. All were afraid of the emperor's rage. Only the poet Derzhavin was not afraid and visited the dying old man. He was in a feverish delirium. On May 18, 1800, the heart of the great commander Alexander Vasilievich Suvorov stopped. One of the best generals in the history of Russia died in disgrace of the emperor, almost alone. But Russia will remember her son through eternity.